Thank you so much, Kasia, for giving me this chance to talk about one of my favorite topics, and this is pottery reuse. So, it's a great honor and pleasure to be presenting some material from Kerma and New Kingdom sites. I will be talking actually about both settlement sites and funerary sites in the area around Sai Islands, Attab and Ginis. So we will be focusing on northern Sudan. So the outline of my talk is more or less sketched on this slide. I will start with a very brief introduction, more or less as a kind of a summary of this introduction. I will discuss a certain bias in our evidence, so that we have a lot of evidence from colonial contexts in Nubia, may this be Middle Kingdom fortresses or New Kingdom temple towns, versus evidence from non-state-built sites in the region. And this will then lead us to some examples from rural contexts, or let's say, quotation mark rural. I will be discussing this a little bit. We will then move to the state-built contexts, to what we could call urban. And then I want to discuss with you the so-called Taskscapes, and these especially in light of cultural entanglement. And I will finish off with some remarks on terminological and methodological issues, or let's say challenges. So it's a really nice topic, but it's also a challenging one. And I will also provide a very brief outlook. As an introduction, I think most of you are well aware that Egypt and Nubia throughout the ages have been in close contact with each other, that there are kind of really very common developments, but there are also certain differences, and the differences are also partly topographical and geological. We should keep this in mind. We also have partly different lifestyles of the people inhabiting the Nile Valley and the deserts. Besides the Nile Valley, we can speak about peasants, about pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, nomads, semi-nomads, etc. So I think this is well known to this audience. And what should also be probably well known is that especially in recent times, research focused on the very, very high complexity of cultural encounters we can reconstruct for this large region along the Nile, including cultural mixing, including intermingling, including technological exchange. And this is, of course, really relevant when we talk about pottery production, pottery use, and also pottery reuse. And my work is very much embedded in recent field work that happened in the last years, especially in the so-called colonial towns, the temple towns of the New Kingdom in Nubia, which resulted in a large amount of fresh data. So this is why I can hopefully present some interesting new ideas. In terms of chronology, we will be focusing on the Middle Bronze Age and the early phase of the Late Bronze Age. So we will mostly be talking about the first half of the second millennium BCE. If you want to use the Egyptological terminology, it would be Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate, and Early New Kingdom. Or if you want to talk about Nubian cultural groups, it's mostly the Kerma period, especially Kerma Moyen, Kerma Classique. Of course, we have to recognize the different regions in northern Sudan. Yeah, what I also wanted to mention in this introduction is that I very, very much like this general book about the life cycle of Roman pottery by Pena. He published it almost 20 years ago, but I think it's very useful. I also like this flow diagram that's on the slide, where you can really see how complex those processes of recycling, of reuse, of discard can be. And this makes it so interesting for us. What Peña also did is that he proposed 3 types of reuse based on Roman pottery, but I think this has some certain degree of general applicability. And so he used or he defined 3 types. Type A, when especially a pot is reused in a similar use as in the first phase of its use without physical modification. And in line with this, his type B is a different use than in the first phase of use without physical modification again. And the type C is a different use, but with physical modification. And in order not to keep this too abstract, I have given here on the slide some examples that we can very, very commonly find, especially in settlement contexts in Egypt, in ancient Egypt. So, for example, just think about the transport amphora in settlement contexts that are continuously reused with similar contents without physical modification. However, we also, so type A is well attested. Type B is also well attested. For example, think about amphora or storage vessels that are reused as pots for infant burials. This can happen in the settlement context. This can happen in the burial site, etc. Think about painter's pots, so pots that are reused with pigments or building ceramics, etc. Type C with a physical modification of the pot would be something like, for example, redesigning the upper part of a vessel into a stand or something else. So that it's very well attested in Egypt, especially at settlements. And of course, if we look at only the sherd material, so the question of reused sherds, the range of use is even wider. Yeah, you know that we have a good attestation of sherds being used as building material, for example, as tempering in bricks, in mud bricks, or also in plaster. And of course, sherds are being reshaped into multifunctional use, into multifunctional tools. Sorry. And the big question now is how is the evidence in Bronze Age Nubia, especially in comparison to what we have in Egypt, thinking about those colonial sites. And here is what I would call a biased evidence, quite obvious. So most of what is published, both for the Middle Kingdom, but also for the New Kingdom, derives from state-built sites, such as Buhin, Semna, Askut, or for the Middle Kingdom, or for the New Kingdom, for example, Sai, Amara West, and Sesebi. In general, there are just few villages or rural sites that have been excavated. I will focus a little bit on our own concession in northern Sudan between Attab and Ferka, the MUAFS concession. And of course, the important site of Gizm el-Arba could, for example, be named, or H25 south of Kawa, for example. It was a long tradition in archaeology to kind of really divide the ceramics from these colonial sites into the large group of wheel-made Egyptian-style ceramics and also considerable group of handmade Nubian-style ceramics. You see the most common types of service, cooking and storage here on the slide. But by now, the state of the art is that we really regard Nubian pottery as an integral part of the material culture of the colonial sites in New Kingdom Nubia, and it's similar already in the Middle Kingdom. So what we focus more now is not to kind of make those two classes and separate them, but to really think about the two way of influences between Egyptian and Nubian traditions, also interactions when it comes to pottery technology, etc. And in line with this, I just briefly want to mention our general methodological approach that we are applying in the framework of the ERC-funded Diverse Nile project. So back in 2020, I came up with this contact space biography concept that was also recently published. You see the screenshot of the article on the right side of the slide. And the main aim of this concept was that we give more relevance to technologies, to the agency of material culture, to the diversity of social contexts in Nubia, that it's different local communities that are inhabiting different social and geographical spaces in Nubia, and that we need more inclusive narratives based on archaeological evidence rather than the previous narrative, mostly based on textual evidence and a little bit biased from an Egyptocentric point of view. So yeah, this is the large framework. Yeah, I'm coming towards the end of this introduction. So based on this kind of shift of perspectives, we could also kind of ask the question whether we really have a bias of evidence or maybe also a kind of a bias of documentation. Because especially if we want to talk about reused sherds, we require the complete sets of ceramic material from various sites. And with complete sets of ceramics, I mean really everything, not just nice pots, complete pots, diagnostic sherds, but really the complete set of non-diagnostic sherds. Especially for reused sherds, there's really kind of the potential danger that we are losing artifacts if we are not really looking at each individual sherd. This in combination with the general lack of excavated Kerma settlement sites is just creating a kind of a challenge, I would say. And since Kasia mentioned in the beginning that I will also include cemetery evidence, yes, this is important. But if we really talk about the Kerma state, we also do have this funerary bias. So except for the city of Kerma, we mostly have Kerma cemeteries to address social practices in the Kerma state. And yeah, this is, of course, a certain limitation. Yeah, and now we really go into the actual topic. So the so-called MUAFS concession is located between Attab and Ferka, just in the neighborhood of Amara West and Sai Island and south of the Dal Cataract, as you can see here on the slide. And I have summarized the data regarding reused sherds from Bronze Age sites that we recovered from this concession. And this was a total of 70. So it's a very small number, especially if you think about settlement sites in Egypt, where you have hundreds and hundreds of those sherds. However, I think this small corpus is still interesting. First of all, it's interesting that in our concession, only 40%, 28, actually derive from domestic sites, from settlement sites. I have listed them on the slide. I will be only talking about this a very substantial group of sherds from the site Attab West 001. In general, most of those settlement sites are nicely datable to the early 18th dynasty, early New Kingdom, but some of them are a little bit earlier and some of them are a little bit later. In addition to those 30% of reused sherds from settlement sites, we have 60% of this small group of reused sherds deriving from Kerma cemeteries. So we have 42 pieces from 2 cemeteries. A huge majority of them is coming from a Kerma cemetery that I will briefly mention, Ginis East 003. In general, we have tried to argue in the last years, and it's also nicely published. I think it's nicely published, but it's for you to check if you haven't seen the paper already. We have published this recent article in World Archaeology, where we tried to kind of present both settlement and funerary archaeology from our concession. So as you can see on the map, we do have a quite substantial number of sites from the Kerma period, from what we call transitional between Kerma and early New Kingdom, and then also from New Kingdom, both regarding domestic sites and mortuary sites. And we think especially the districts of Attab and Ginis that you can see here are very, very good examples for rural sites of Kerma and early New Kingdom. You can see with the different symbols on the map that most of the settlement sites are actually located here on the west, whereas the cemeteries are located on the east bank. Let's have a look at the settlement sites or at the reused material from the settlement sites. As I said, it's a small group, 28 pieces, and the majority of these pieces are actually scrapers. One of them is illustrated on the slide, and I also kind of made a small diagram with the different subcategories of tools. We have scrapers, we have token lids, we have really proper lids that we can nicely identify. There are also some weights. There are also unclear pieces, and there is one polishing tool. So within this quite small group, we do have 6 subcategories, which is, from my point of view, quite a considerable variability. So it shows that despite the small amount, various types of tools were created from those pottery sherds. And in addition, various material was used. It's mostly Egyptian wheel-made pottery, like you can see on the slide, but also the sizes can differ from very small to quite large. As I promised, I will focus a little bit on the site Attab West 001, that is the find spot of 23 of those 28 pieces. The location of the site is here, and we think it is a small marketplace, a domestic site, probably on a former island, very close to the modern Nile, in the middle of very sandy dunes nowadays. And you can see that in the field, it kind of appears like a small mound. The material culture and the dating of this site is based on our excavation that we conducted between 2022 and 2025. We found some substantial evidence for quartz crushing, large grindstones, quartz flakes, other stone tools. So this site seems to be connected to gold working. The first use of it is maybe in this transitional phase, late Kerma, early 18th dynasty, but the main phase is Thutmosite, and it continues into the mid-18th dynasty. I have just illustrated a few pottery sherds that are very nicely comparable, for example, to Sai, but also to other sites in the periphery of Amara. And I also show you here some clay objects. So this is a fragment of a net weight and one of several clay weights we found. And a very eroded lid of a kochel pot, where we could also talk about the reuse of this kochel pot. But this is not what I'm going to do today, because we are focusing on the ceramics. So in a nutshell, our interpretation of this rural site, Attab West 001, is that it is probably a seasonal market, a meeting point of diverse groups, maybe connected with gold exhibitions, with gold mining. We do have some storage pits, we have storage areas, we have some mud brick buildings, and we can trace, based on the artifacts, activities like fishing, like weighing, and also pottery production. We had some unfired and overfired sherds, so this is really interesting. interesting. The pottery in general is very, very similar to Sai, but we have a larger amount of Nubian wares, mostly cooking ware, that you can see some examples here. We have some vessels with repair holes. So this brings us again to the reuse, the fixing, the repairing of vessels, which is quite common for those Nubian globular bowls. This was kind of an outline of the general characteristics of this site. Let's now look at the statistics of this Attab 001 regarding the reused sherds. I already mentioned we only have 23 reused sherds, and with a total amount of pottery sherds of roughly shortly above 12,000, with a quite considerable amount of Nubian sherds, this is really a small amount. So if you really talk about the totals, the reused sherds are 0.19. So it's a tiny amount, and I will come back to this quantity later in this talk. Within the 23 reused sherds, the most common category are scrapers. And it is very, very clear that for those scrapers, there is a real preference for wheel-made Egyptian-style closed vessels, especially for marl clays, but we also have Nile clay vessels. And I just want to remind you again that this is interesting because the general repertoire of all the ceramics from this site has 22% of Nubian wares. And this is really a substantial amount for an early New Kingdom site. So we only have one reused sherd that was made out of a Nubian cooking pot. This is this one. It's kind of very nicely circular shaped, and I would interpret it as a lid, but whether it's really a lid is a bit questionable. But what I want to say with this is that it's very, very clear that the people who reshaped those pot sherds into tools made a conscious decision what material they were choosing, which sherds they used. And so for scrapers, especially the marl clay vessels are just, of course, preferable because they are harder, they are less porous, etc., etc. I have illustrated some examples of those reused sherds on the slide. This one is interesting. It's from an Egyptian seer vessel, and I think it's probably a net weight, a fragmented net weight, and not a lid. But again, it's a little bit difficult to say. It's quite large. This small piece is maybe a token, maybe a lid for something very small. And this is something that we encounter very frequently in the 18th dynasty, both in Egypt and in Nubia. It's the lower part of a dish with a ring base with a perforation in the center of the ring base. And yeah, the function is difficult to say, maybe also for closing something, maybe something else. Yeah, but very nicely very nice because it's one of the sherds that was definitely imported from Egypt to Attab. We also have a few pieces that are, for me at least, of an unclear function. So if any one of you has a good idea about this small object, apologies for the low quality of the pictures. I would appreciate it. So we have here a piece that is very small. It is kind of a, yeah, somehow like a spool shaped. I hope you can see it. This is the top. This is the side view, and in the middle it has this kind of almost a drilling-like thing from a thread, maybe. So I thought maybe it is somehow related to weaving, to spinning. We do have other artifacts that we associate with those activities, but it's very small, and I haven't seen something like this in any of the other sites I have been working on. Yeah, so a very small corpus, but nevertheless quite interesting. Let's now look at the material from the cemeteries. We do have 42 reused sherds from Kerma cemeteries, especially from the one I will present in a minute, Ginis East 003. But here I just presented the general numbers. The majority of those reused sherds are actually shovels, digging tools, 76%. So more than the scrapers from the settlement side. We also have a substantial number of lids, and we have two pieces that are, again, very unclear in their function. So compared to what we had in the settlement side, we have here a larger group, but only 3 categories, with the clear majority being shovels. And it's not only Bronze Age pieces, it's coming from a Bronze Age site, but it also includes 4 medieval sherds, shovels for looters, people who were digging those tombs. And the small and limited variability of this corpus of reused sherds includes both original burial equipment like the lids, but also those ad hoc tools for digging, for looting those tombs. And this is, I think, something that all of us working at cemetery sites have probably encountered. Just to prove that the evidence for reused sherds as burial goods in Kerma tombs is well attested. I have illustrated here 2 examples from the Kerma cemetery on Sai Island, nicely published by Brigitte Gracienne. You can see here one of the lids from a reused sherd and one piece that she interpreted maybe as a spindle hole. It's a little bit unclear. So in general, this is attested in considerable numbers, not large numbers, but it's well attested. Let's put it this way. Yeah, similar to what I did for the settlement side, I also want to present the statistics for this Kerma cemetery. We have only excavated part of the cemetery. We have excavated 5 trenches. They are illustrated on this map here. And from these trenches, the total amount of pottery was a little bit like almost 4,500 pieces. So a mediocre number, I would say. And in this number, we had 41 reused sherds. So from the total, it would then be almost 1%. So still a very small number, but considerably more than in Attab West 001 in the settlement side. So this is quite interesting. This slide presents you some of the examples from Ginis East 003. We have a large variety of sizes of different parts of the vessels. We have mostly body sherds. We have body sherds from, sorry, this touchpad is today very sensitive. Okay, I will not touch it. You can hopefully see on the left side that we have body sherds of Egyptian clay vessels. In the middle, we have Kerma where body sherds. There's also a small circular one that might be a lid. The others are scrapers or shovels. And on the right side of the screen, you have 2 very nice rim sherds that have been reused as shovels. And I mentioned it already, we also have some pieces that are made from medieval ceramics. This is not surprising. We have a medieval site very nearby, partly overlapping the Kerma cemetery. So I think this is still really an ad hoc tool that looters created. They found it on the surface and they just took this medieval piece, which is quite large. It was then broken in 3 pieces and we re-excavated it. And it gives us a kind of a terminus antequem non for at least this phase of looting in this specific part of the cemetery. Yeah, so I would like to discuss with you, or to kind of reflect whether we see some common patterns of ceramic reuse from both cemeteries and settlements in the Attab to Ferka region, in this what we can call rural northern Sudan. What is definitely common in both sites and contexts is that we have repairing of pots. This is mostly done for Nubian vessels, but we can also find it in Egyptian-style vessels. Also, the Kerma cemetery yielded one very nice clay vessel that was repaired several times. Both settlements and cemeteries yield reshaped pottery sherds, especially scrapers, but probably with a slightly different function. So in the cemetery, the shovels; in the settlements, different uses. And both also have a substantial number of lids, and sometimes also what we can maybe address as tokens. Yeah, and here you just have two nice examples from the Kerma cemetery, those beakers with traces of reuse and repair. The big question is, of course, do we also see some differences? Do we see differences between the cemeteries and the settlements? And here again, I would first say we do have those common things like repairing, but if we want, we could dig deep into the individual details and histories and use lives of the pots, and then we might see already some differences. If a pot was repaired and ended up in a tomb as a grave good, was it maybe repaired to make it suitable as a grave good, or was it reused during the domestic use? So this is something that is associated with value, but that's difficult to judge. In the settlement, it's definitely, of course, related to the real actual use of the pot. Then we have this difference in function. So shovels in the cemetery for digging, whereas we have in the settlement different activities, maybe multifunctional tools, if we talk about the scrapers. And the main difference is the variability. So in the cemeteries, we really mostly have lids and shovels, whereas in the settlements, we have a higher variability, of course, because we have a more complex mix of social practices and various tasks and activities. I also wonder whether we have a slightly different picture of those ad hoc tools for looters in the cemetery versus multifunctional tools in settlements, because in settlements, the scrapers are partly replaced by tools in other materials. So think about the bone tools we find, the wooden tools we find, the silex tools, the metal tools. All of this is quite common in Bronze Age sites. And so this might also have an influence in what we see in our reused sherds in the settlements. Yeah, I now focused on this MUAFS concession, the rural context, and let's now turn quickly to some examples from colonial context. So I will show you some examples from Sai Island, some examples from Amara West. They are both located very close by, as you can see on the map. In Sai Island, we have been excavating with the Across Borders project in the 2010s for several seasons, and we were mostly focusing on two excavation sectors in the east part of the New Kingdom town and in the western part of the New Kingdom town. And I immediately show you here the statistics from the city of Sai regarding the pottery. So we excavated several years in this colonial town, and we have more than 220,000 sherds. So it's, of course, a larger amount of what we found in Attab West 001. It's also a much larger site. And within this amount, we had 615 reused sherds. And this would make 0.3% of the total of the ceramics. This also includes non-New Kingdom material, so post-New Kingdom material, but the majority is really New Kingdom material. Nevertheless, there is a slight increase in terms of quantities compared to the rural site, Attab West 001. So we can maybe keep this in mind. The majority of the reused sherds from Sai are marl clay vessels, marl clay sherds imported from Egypt, but we also have some Canaanite imported vessels, so amphorae that were reused, and there are also some Nubian sherds. What I wanted to stress with this picture is that we also in this colonial context, early New Kingdom context, we find Kerma vessels with repair holes, so that have been used for a considerable time span and then ended up in an early 18th dynasty context. And of course, one could ask who really reused, repaired Kerma vessels, but also Kerma sherds during this early 18th dynasty colonial time in Sai. And I will also come back to this at the end of this talk. The material from Sai was already published in 2020 in the Across Borders volume. This is why I will be quite brief here. I have illustrated some of the characteristic types on the slide. We have lids, we have scrapers, we have different types. And in general, the reused sherds are quite a considerable category of small finds within the general material culture from Sai city. What is interesting is that we can compare our corpus with a Ramesside city in Egypt, Kantir. Christina Riedler published the material of reused sherds from Pyramesse very nicely, and she could observe that 80% were made from marl clay and the remaining parts mostly from Nile clay. However, what is most interesting is that she could show that there was a preference for rim sherds. You can also see this on the figure that is taken from her publication. So 155 out of 275 scrapers were made from rim sherds. And this is really interesting because both my corpus from Sai, but also what I know from Elephantine of the 18th dynasty, does not show this preference for rim sherds. It's the majority is body sherds, and it cannot be a kind of a bias in documentation because we definitely checked all of the sherds, and so no rim sherds have been missed for sure. But it seems to be something different. So it may be a question of dating, 18th dynasty versus Ramesside. It maybe is a deliberate choice. Of course, it's very clever and time-saving to reuse a rim sherd, especially if it's a very nice rim like those Ramesside meat jars with a very nice lip, because you only have to shape the other three edges and not four. But it's still interesting that at least in those 18th dynasty sites I know, there is not this preference for rims. What I also wanted to briefly mention is that we have evidence for painter's pots, for palettes in Sai, and this was published by Kate Fulcher. And a reuse of beer jars, flower pots as painter's pots or as palettes is of course something secondary because the pot was not produced for this function, but it was then secondary used for this. It's very common in Egypt, but also in the temple town cities in northern Sudan. And it might really be especially related to these because we know from Sai that some of the mud brick buildings were plastered and painted. And so this might really be a difference to what we have in rural sites such as Attab West 001, where we have mud brick buildings, but for now, no evidence for this for these painters' pots. just want to move now or mention Amara West. Kate also published very, very nicely the material for painting Amara West, a substantial volume showing the chaîne opératoire for making pigments in Amara. And here reused sherds play a substantial role. So it's also very interesting for us who want to know more about reused sherds. Let's go back to Sai and here to the cemetery use. I will only mention very briefly some reuse of vessels in the elite cemetery of Sai. And in order to compare this to what we have seen from the Kerma cemetery. This is based on our excavation of Tomb 26 on Sai. It was published already in 2021. It's a very nice shaft tomb with a pyramid chapel. And what we found there is a kind of a reuse of vessels as with a different function, as a different category. What you can see here, for example, are pseudo-canopic jars. They were not used as actual canopic jars, but they are imported markley jugs that were produced in Egypt as a simple jug of small size. And in Nubia, in Sai, they were redesigned as this set of 4 to accompany one burial with those clay canopic lids. So this is an interesting thing if we talk about reuse in general. And then, of course, we have the reuse of sherds. And this is interesting because we have a larger percentage of reused sherds. If we count all the ceramic sherds we had in Tomb 26, 57 reused sherds are representing almost 5% of all ceramics. So this is for now a completely different number of what we were previously talking about, both in Sai City and in the rural sites I mentioned before. It's interesting that most of those shovels were actually found in the shaft, and there is quite good evidence that the looting of the site of this tomb already started during the New Kingdom, and we had different types of materials and sizes for these shovels. I promised to also briefly mention Amara West, the neighboring urban New Kingdom colonial town of Sai. The material from the town is still work in progress. It's currently being prepared for publication. But Valentina Gasperini already published very nicely the pottery from the cemeteries. And in this book, she also presented some shovels in the material. And interestingly, those shovels were also mostly found in shafts, so very similar to what we had in Sai. Yeah, and what I would propose is that the differences regarding reused sherds between elite cemeteries and state-built settlements are actually quite similar to the differences that we see already in the rural sites between settlements and cemeteries. So again, the repairing of pot is well attested in both contexts, settlement and cemetery. We do have differences in the variability in the amount of subcategories, mostly shovels in the tombs, and in the city we have a more diverse and more complex use of reused sherds. And it might be that we have differences in quantities, but this is very difficult to say because I presented you the town of Sai and this one tomb, one elite tomb with this quite substantial amount of reused sherds. But this could also be individual cases, and of course also the question of post-depositional processes comes in. So Tomb 26 was partly well preserved, but it was several times plundered. So there was looting going on during several times. And what we in the end are finding is, of course, heavily related to this post-depositional process or processes in plural. Nevertheless, I would say what we see here in the colonial context indicates that in general, we should think more about context and setting than to make a difference between elite and sub-elite when we are talking about the practice of reused sherds. And with this, I will finish off with some remarks on terminological and methodological challenges. Part of this was already published in my article that appeared in 2024, where I was mostly focusing on Elephantine and Sai Island. What I outlined in this article is, and this is why I can be brief here, is that the examples of lids are interesting because they illustrate certain blurred boundaries between category of finds in the archaeological documentation. So whether we call something a ceramic small find or whether we regard it as a pottery vessel. And there are pottery vessels that are lids, but there are also reshaped pottery sherds that are lids. So it's really interesting, and it's not an easy task. And especially in the New Kingdom, we do have those very, very common reshaping of the very nice ring dishes that you can, ring bases that you can see here. And we also find this in Sai. In general, one could continue talking and discussing the question of lids, also especially for the Kerma context. So all of those lids that you see here are deriving from Kerma contexts. This is a complete vessel that we found in situ with a stone lid in Ginis East 003. So lids can be made in pottery, in clay, in stone, and in wood, and maybe also in some other organic materials. In Ginis East 003, we also found this small lid that is actually an Egyptian wheel-made lid. But we also have reshaped Kerma pot sherds that are used as lids. So it's really interesting, and the question is who decides which lids goes with which pot, and yeah, there are many interesting things to keep in mind. I also wanted to show this beautiful painted vase with a cover that was found in Kerma. There are certain methodological challenges when it comes to reused sherds, also in the context I have been discussing. When we think about contexts such as Sai City with more than 200,000 pottery sherds, it's the quantities that are quite a challenge, I would say. It's also the expertise that is needed if you want to really document the specific wear and the clay of the sherds that were reused as tools. So marl clays, oasis clays, imported amphora, specific Kerma wares, etc., etc. Another challenge is the preservation. So also kind of this evidence bias that I addressed in the introduction, but also possibilities and limits regarding scientific analysis. If we really want to talk about the reuse of pots especially, but also if we want to know what is specifically inside palettes, for example, the pigments that I've briefly shown, then we need certain chemical analysis, and especially for organic residue analysis, both for Egypt and Nubia, it is fair to say that this is still in its infancy, but it has huge potential also to understanding the complex use life of ceramic vessels. And what I want to briefly mention is that we have made a substantial progress in terms of theoretical frameworks. And one of the concepts I like to address, especially for reused sherds, is what Tim Ingold called Taskscapes. So we can talk about different activities that are connected with those reused sherds, and in general, Taskscapes allows you to analyze material culture from a multi-perspective level, including scientific analysis. And it also ties in nicely to what Rod Salisbury called soilscapes. The importance to also consider cultural soilscapes, where activities actually took place and how it was organized spatially. In this context, I would like to stress that we believe that, especially for Bronze Age Nubia, but also for other periods, it is really crucial to consider the hinterland of what we call urban towns or cities as an integral part of the urban fabric. And I'm delighted that Bruce Williams is also in the audience. Taskscapes of digging. I think this would be a very interesting topic we could follow up. These are just some rough ideas, or just the note that we do have digging tools made from reused sherds, especially in cemeteries, both Kerma cultures, New Kingdom, Colonial sites. But we also have some similar sherds from Kerma goldworking sites. And here I refer to the article by Bruce Williams, where he presented Rochelle Gourouf, this Kerma goldworking site in the Fourth Cataract. And so of course it's very logical to use pottery sherds as ad hoc tool throughout the ages, but this deliberate use, thinking about the hardness, thinking about the shape and everything, might really be interesting to consider in a larger analysis of taskscapes of digging. Taskscapes in light of cultural entanglement are something I would like to stress, especially thinking about Sai Island, but also about the site Attab 001. Attab 001 compares very, very nicely to another small site that was excavated by Anna Stevens and Anna Garnett in the hinterland of Amara West, 2R18, and they proposed that what they see there in both architecture, archaeological evidence, and material culture suggests, I quote, the close sharing of space and activities. And so they proposed that both Egyptian and Nubian populations were here sharing space and activities. And of course, they are also sharing the tools. And so, of course, for us, it's very relevant to document whether a reused sherd is made from a Kerma pot or from a Canaanite amphora or from an Egyptian clay vessel. But the people who were actually using it and making it are probably very mixed and are just really inhabiting this space and sharing this space and their activities. And this is probably more important to consider. Another recent approach that I just want to briefly mention is objectscapes, as defined by Pitts and Verslois in their nice article from 2021. And Renan Lemos introduced this to Egyptology, Nubian studies. So he introduced it for the New Kingdom in northern Sudan. And the main benefit of this objectscape approach, from my perspective, is really that it allows us to kind of see those different ways of consumption that are really depending on region, on society, that we have various ways of handling the same objects, and that we see multiple Nubias, multiple Egypts, the very, very complex impact of objects. This is, of course, also relevant for the reuse of pottery sherds. Yeah, I'm close to finish, and we could also ask very large questions. For example, why are people reusing pot sherds? Is it only practical because they are lying there and they want a digging tool, or do they also have other motives? And I think, first of all, it's maybe not useful to ask this question very exclusively. So it's probably always more complex, and we have different backgrounds and different motivations depending on the people. And we should also consider aesthetic reasons. some of the sherds are really, really nice. And so I think they really picked them on purpose. Of course, there are also practical reasons. That's very clear. It's available. They have limited costs, etc. But nevertheless, there are also certain dynamics that we should consider. And this brings us again to social practices in the community. They are time-specific, they are local, and we also have individual decisions. And this is, for example, also something that we can consider when we talk about the reuse of coffins, the reuse of complete graves, etc. And this is something we also find both in Kerma culture, but also in the colonial sites, for example. So, and now I will really finish this talk with a very short outlook and some brief ideas. So I would say that at the moment, there's definitely no consistent approach to reuse and recycling, especially for the period I was discussing. And we should be a bit aware of the certain risk that if we always think about something reused, something repaired, something recycled, that this is a cheaper solution, that this is maybe lacking proper skills, that this is just not the case. It needs really knowledge to reshape a nice shirt into a tool, and the repairing of pots is also not an easy task, etc., etc. And it also has a lot of complex patterns of values that we should probably stress more. What I also think is we should embrace the uncertainty with the reuse of potsherds. Ambiguity definitely exists. It always exists in archaeology, but especially in this type of material. So it's okay to see certain differences, but also to say that in some aspects, there remains uncertainty. We definitely need more context-related analysis, and I think it's really crucial to combine, if it's possible, if it's feasible, settlement and funerary evidence. And it also is always a question of the levels of detail. So, of course, it's a difference if we ask questions about the reuse in Nubia, the reuse at one specific site like Sai, or the reuse in one specific tomb, etc. And depending on this, our foci can, of course, differ. Yeah, and with this, I would like to thank you for your kind attention. I'm grateful to many, many colleagues and institutions, especially to our wonderful Sudanese friends and colleagues. And yeah, I'm looking much forward to questions if there are some. Thank you so much.